Hello, my name is Pedro Gambaro Leiva, and today we are checking my two dashboards, which are trying to solve the problematic of the carbon footprint generated by each country or by each region. First of all, we can see in our map the carbon footprint of each country, starting with the United States or with Australia, which both of them have a pretty high carbon footprint. After that, we can continue with the Earth's required per region. This is going to reference the amount of Earths needed to fulfill or the amount of Earths that it would take in order to cover for the standard carbon footprint if these countries continue to do these practices, being North America the highest one, the European region the second one, and finally the Middle East the third highest one. In the fourth graph, we can also see the carbon footprint per GDP per capita. This means that we are comparing the amount of revenue generated by each, let's say, country, even though it is separated by colors, which represent regions. And the y-axis is going to talk about the carbon footprint, in which we can see an outlier here inside this region, which would probably be Belgium, which is pretty high. And even though they generate a pretty high GDP per capita, they also have a ginormous carbon footprint being super high. Also, finally, the last graph is going to talk about the ecological footprint per region, which explains the amount of money spent by each region in order to maintain their carbon footprint down. Now, as we can see, North America has a pretty high ecological footprint. Now imagine what could their carbon footprint be if they didn't maintain or spend enough money into trying to lower it down. As we can see, Africa has a pretty low GDP per capita, and most of the countries tend to have a pretty low carbon footprint. This may be due to the lack of factories or to the lack of advanced countries, which mean that not also these countries are less developed than others, but they are also producing a much lower carbon footprint. Probably North America has a lot of businesses and companies and factories which generate a pretty high carbon footprint. As we can see, comparing to the European Union, the two countries in North America, which would be the United States and Canada, are pretty much in balance with the countries in the European Union, even though there's an outlier here which has a super large carbon footprint, which would be, I believe, this one. And they are also trying to spend a lot of money into developing a solution for this, but I don't believe it's good enough because I don't know if this data is faulty, but it doesn't make much sense. Now, continuing with the other dashboard, as we can see here, now we are trying to relate the HDI, which is the Human Development Index, and the carbon footprint. And as we can see in the two graphs that we can see at the right, countries which are highly developed, mostly the ones found in the European Union and the Middle East, tend to have a pretty high carbon footprint, which in this case would be 114. Now, continuing, we can see that these regions also have a biological deficit, meaning that yearly they are losing species or losing forests, and this way making their carbon footprint much worse. But interestingly, there's also a category, which would be the zero point 0.9 Human Development Index, which is also stated by the European Union, Asia Pacific, and North America, that generates a much lower carbon footprint. And we can say, well, maybe these countries require 48 Earths compared to the 106 Earths needed by the some countries that are highly developed too. So, as we can see, the Human Development Index and carbon footprint also show us that the highly developed countries, which in this case would be zero point 0.7 and 0.8, generate a pretty large carbon footprint. So, what could my solution be, and what can I propose in order for us to maintain this carbon footprint low and try to encourage countries into maintaining biological reserves and or to lower their carbon footprint? As we can see, Latin America has a pretty standard population. It's pretty high, but not as high as others. And most of the countries here are in the zero point 0.7 category, but there are some in the zero point 0.8, which require much less Earths. So, what can I propose? As we can see, there are a lot of countries which are in the zero point 0.7 and zero point 0.8 areas. Now, these countries should implement what the highly developed countries are doing in order for us to try to lower their carbon footprint. Also, we can try to ignore these lowly developed countries as they are mostly in Africa, and as we mentioned before, they are probably not accountant of these things as they tend to have less factories. So, in my opinion, countries that are highly developed should follow what super developed countries are doing in order for them to lower their carbon footprint. And lastly, they should try to follow the North American steps in order for them to keep their carbon footprint down, as the United States is spending lots of money trying to improve their ecological footprint. That was everything. Thank you.